Okay, thank you for the introduction, Todd. I hope I live up to it in terms of explaining complex ideas. I'm going to try to link these three things: ecosystems, desert ecosystems, groundwater, and dust. They have, it's a three-way interaction. So I'm going to first describe groundwater and fold in desert ecosystems and dust at a global scale, and then I'll bring it down to a more regional scale and show some of the finer points of the interaction between these. Perhaps if you are me, you wouldn't initially know, or from the title of the talk, why these things are linked. But maybe you do. Maybe you come from a desert region and that these connections make a lot of sense to you. So a logical place for me to start is with a plot of water consumption. And I'm sure you're aware of the fact that humans, population's increasing and we need water. And so water use has gone up. The orange line there is consumption, and the blue line is evaporation from reservoirs. And one of the interesting things here, the reason I started here, is that evaporation is really, other than making water too polluted to drink or use, evaporation is the only way that we lose water, fresh water, from our basins. And one of the things you have to realize that I live up at the top of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and any water that I use, unless it's evaporated from my garden or something like that, goes right back into the Potomac River and is eventually drank in DC, or possibly goes to the ocean. So, water is continuously being reused as it moves down through a watershed, right? But this evaporation is a fundamental loss of water from the system. One way of getting around evaporative losses from reservoirs is to use groundwater. But groundwater is a very complex thing. There are many different types of groundwater, and they have very different types of uses and ways of thinking about groundwater. So in this example here, we see that there's fractured rock groundwater. There's saturated sediments. These are, example here, gravels and sands they're saturated with groundwater. Sometimes those aquifers are very deep, and sometimes they're very shallow. And so one of the themes of this talk is the difference between deep aquifers and shallow aquifers, and the sustainability of their use for water for humans, and also their interactions with ecosystems. So one of the things that, because this diversity of different groundwater types, one of the things that you see is that groundwater here has a very large range in residence time. So if we go from atmospheric water, river channels, swamps, lakes and reservoirs, down to groundwater, we see that groundwater is sometimes 10,000 years old or more. But sometimes groundwater is turning over very rapidly, and the residence time of groundwater can be as short as weeks to months to a year. So it's this range here which makes groundwater so hard to manage and to use sustainably. So linked in with this residence time, of course, is the balance between recharge and withdrawal, right? And so in many parts of the world, groundwater is being withdrawn faster than it's being recharged. All right, and so this is clearly at the definition of sustainable use, right? If you're taking water faster than you're recharging it into groundwater, that's going to be that's not sustainable. However, this is primarily a problem for reservoirs that are not recharging very rapidly. And those are often those deep aquifers that have really long residence times. Okay, so those deep aquifers, we see that in some parts they're not being used sustainably. We can manage this by just not relying on them, right? So but that's a fairly simple balance, right? Inputs versus outputs, and understanding what those are. With shallow aquifers, we have a much different situation. They have very short residence times, right? And so this could be used to our advantage. During droughts, we could pump from these things, right? And then during wet times, they're going to be recharged very rapidly, and that short residence time would allow us to manage for sustainable use at a much shorter time scale. We're not talking 10,000 years. We can just talk a year or a decade time scales. If we did this properly, we would reduce that evaporative losses from reservoirs, right? So if we had extra water, we could actually inject this water into a shallow groundwater system. We could store it for a decade or for a year or something like that, and then take it out later. And this sounds like a really great system, and in fact, it's used in many parts of the world for storing water. However, there's these added complications. Okay, so groundwater has influence on vegetation in the form of wetlands, riparian zones, in the floodplain. There are also the springs and seeps, and these things are characteristic of desert landscapes. We've all heard of oases, right? So why are there some places on landscapes that seem to have groundwater that's very close to the surface? And if we start to manage that groundwater, pump it during dry years and inject it back into the ground during wet years, aren't we going to affect those little ecosystems, right? Another thing about surface water, another thing about groundwater, shallow groundwater, is it's strongly affected by surface water diversions. We've already diverted most of the surface water in deserts. We're managing for streams and rivers in deserts. And if we do that inappropriately, we can affect the groundwater adjacent to those surface water areas. And the last one is this here, that groundwater has an effect on the surface soil chemistry. Okay, and so these are the points that I'm going to be talking about throughout the talk. So where would you find shallow groundwater? Well, groundwater, if in a desert, if you have extra water, it generally will percolate down into the groundwater and leave the system either into a river or directly into the ocean, right? And so we don't expect to see shallow groundwater in deserts. Shallow groundwater should sink down deeper, right? And you could have certain confining layers that allow shallow groundwater to exist. But by and large, shallow groundwater in deserts exist in endoheric basins. Okay, endoheric basins are areas of interior drainage in deserts. These are places that, primarily because of the aridity, have not had enough surface flow to run rivers through the mountains, to break a way out of their confining basins and make it to the ocean. All right, so these are places where water flows inland, and what it does is it basically will collect, and it can't get out, so it forms a shallow groundwater aquifer. And in some places, that water, these basins are so large, or there's just enough precipitation, we get really large lakes. And so we've got some examples. On the next slide, I'll show you an example from Lake Chad. We've also got the Aral Sea. These are places that have recently caught a lot of news in that they're centered in these endoheric basins. Surface water is flowing into the center of these basins, and they're forming these large lakes. These lakes historically were much larger, but because of surface water diversions and groundwater use within the basin, this example here for Lake Chad, for example, the lake area is decreasing very rapidly. So one of the things you see here is that when this lake is reduced in size, what it leaves behind is this large wetland, right? So you have to imagine what's happening here. You're getting enough water so that you have a lake, but as you divert the surface water, that lake is dropping, right? It's evaporating. It's also, the recharge is reduced relative to the evaporative losses. But what happens is just as the lake gets below the surface of the earth, there's a threshold change, right? The system goes from being highly evaporative to being much less evaporative. The amount of vegetation that moves in following the edges of this lake has a lot to do with this threshold, right? Because vegetation acts as a pump, pumping water from the groundwater up into the atmosphere. In some examples, the amount of vegetation is not as apparent. And here in the Aral Sea, we have some areas of vegetation, but in a lot of cases, we get these large areas where we just have a desert playa, we call it. It's a salt flat, basically. And so when these lakes dry up, you're left with a very large area of shallow to moderately deep groundwater with no vegetation above it. So here's an example. So if you imagine, here's your lake basin. In the slide I'm not showing you, there's a lake there, right? But just as the water drops below the surface and becomes a water table, you switch to this system where evaporative losses are from the soil surface instead of from a water surface. And that forms these evaporate minerals right at the surface of the surface of the basin. Those minerals are highly friable, we call them. They're easily mobilized by wind. What happens is those salt crystals, they're obviously, they're small crystals. You can imagine them like any salt you put on even on your dinner at night. But that is just half the story. They're also in there expanding within soil aggregates and breaking them apart and making the soil become into really small particles. Basically, they're easily distributed by wind. If the groundwater drops below the capillary fringe, that fringe is the area where groundwater can be wicked up to the surface, those minerals don't form, and they generally don't, and they're not, the lake stops being a source of dust. So what we're finding is that if we have really deep groundwater beneath one of these lakes that dries up, we have a system that is a low potential for dust, all right? Because the groundwater is deep enough that it's not intersecting with the surface of the earth in that lake basin. As we bring the groundwater up, we start to have a higher potential for dust right up to the point where the groundwater breaks the surface. And then there's a threshold effect and it drops back down, and we have very little dust potential. So here's an example photograph of the Aral Sea during a dust storm. And the Aral Sea is one of the largest sites of dust production, fugitive dust on the globe. This dust has been linked to changes in the climate around the Aral Sea. It now has a more continental climate. The dust reduces air quality. It causes reduced radiation making it to the surface of the earth because of all the reduced visibility. And so it's causing a lot of changes for the people who live there. So here's an example of all of the major dust sources on Earth. What we see here is the aerosol index. This is done by satellite. The satellite is basically looking at the transparency of the atmosphere on daily timescales. And so we're seeing how the number of days above some threshold in the aerosol index. And we see that these areas fall pretty well overlap with these endoheric basins. And certainly many of the largest sources are in endoheric basins. So we can use this to understand basically as a founding principles for dust generation globally. When this dust is produced, it has many different effects around the globe. For example, here we have the Gobi Desert dust makes it across the Pacific Ocean, and we can actually see it in California. If you live in California, you might have heard about dust storms coming across the Pacific Ocean. This dust is responsible in Hawaii, for example. Todd mentioned I've worked there. Tropical rainforests in Hawaii are on very old soils, on some of the older islands. These are 4-million-year-old soils. The soils have been so deprived of rock-derived nutrients by the tropical forests that grow there that the forests are actually limited by minerals such as phosphorus, which only come from rocks. But because of this dust, the inputs of dust to these systems, their productivity is maintained. There's also evidence that dust making it into the southern Pacific Ocean is responsible for the productivity of the oceans, which is an important feedback to global warming through the sequestration of carbon dioxide. A few other examples. We have obviously poor air quality in the source regions of where these dry high groundwater playas are. We also have evidence of reduced productivity of the desert ecosystems that are in those vicinities. We have increases in the salt deposition in the surrounding landscape. And the final one here is that dust that makes it across the Atlantic Ocean affects the coral reefs in the Caribbean and brings with it soil organisms which get deposited onto corals and has been shown to cause the coral decline. And I don't know how often you make it down to the Caribbean, but if you've gone over the last 10 to 15 to 20 years, the corals really have changed a lot down there, and a lot of that is due to the dust deposition from Africa. Okay, so now I'm going to try to bring this home a little bit more to North America. North America is not generally a really large, globally important source of dust, but this model that I've described fits in well with what we see in the Great Basin. The Great Basin is an endoheric basin right here. It has many playas that were originally, or not originally, but at the last glacial maximum were lakes. This is a map of lake extent through about 20,000 years ago in blue. And you can see that we have, trying to get my bearings here a little bit, there's a very faint line here. This is the border of Nevada that comes down like this and across. And so we've got basically an expanded Great Salt Lake. It was Lakebonneville. This area, all these lake sediments have basically left behind these large flat basins that have very friable soils, very high salt content. And in many cases, the groundwater remains high in these areas. So as these lakes dried up over the last 20,000 years, there's a lot of variability in how much vegetation grew up to replace those lakes. In some cases, the groundwater dropped quickly and left a hard clay pan playa. In some cases, the groundwater has been maintained fairly close to the surface, largely because there's enough rain and snow melt from the mountains to maintain those high groundwater tables. So this variability means that there's a lot of variability in the risk for wind erosion and dust generation across the Great Basin. So I'm going to bring now, even zoom down a little bit closer to one particular place. Here's the Owens Valley. I use this as an outdoor experimental laboratory for studying the effects of groundwater, ecosystems, and dust. And in particular, this valley is really important because it is the watershed for the city of Los Angeles. Okay, so you're really looking at a place where it looks like a natural landscape, but it is heavily modified by human behavior and our actions to manage groundwater and surface water in this valley. So Owens Valley receives about 14 centimeters of precipitation a year. That's very little. It's a very arid place. However, up here in the Sierras, we get a lot of snowpack. And during the summer, that snow melts, and it maintains high groundwater throughout the valley. That groundwater sustains groundwater-dependent vegetation in most areas of the valley. So I talked about this diversity, and in fact, Owens Valley has all the different types, basically, of vegetation that you get that is dependent on groundwater at different depths. Owens Valley also has very high wind speeds that are generally characteristic of deserts in general, but in Owens Valley we get diurnal cycles of wind that come up out of the Mojave Desert, and basically you can think of the Mojave Desert as breathing, or the mountains anyway, the Sierras, breathing through Owens Valley. And a typical day in Owens Valley could see 50-mile-an-hour winds without any problem at all. So Owens Valley history. Here we have essentially starts around 1860, at least in terms of from the view of Europeans. We've got this is LA here, not Owens Valley, but at that time, Owens Valley was settled for agricultural use. And they started to build channels and canals to divert the surface water that was running off of those Sierra snowpack. And in around 1910, LA had gotten to a size where it needed to start looking elsewhere for more water. And so if this is LA here, LA's building, getting bigger and bigger, and they're initially tapping groundwater in the LA basin and surface water there. But they eventually wanted more water so they could grow to be a bigger city, and so they built the LA aqueduct from Los Angeles. And if you read the history, there's some excellent books out there. Cadillac Desert, I highly recommend it. it describes basically this water grab. LA goes into Owens Valley. They bought up all the land rights, all the water rights by buying most of the land. And then they started construction of the LA aqueduct very rapidly. They also petitioned Congress to make all the remaining land in Owens Valley a national forest, so nobody would start growing crops there that needed water. So this diagram just shows that at that time, groundwater basically starts to go up underneath LA, but the groundwater starts to go down in Owens Valley. At that same time, I neglected to mention the Owens Lake. So basically, the Owens River, all that snow melt, goes down to the Owens Lake, where it would eventually evaporate, right? Well, at this time, the Owens Lake dries up. So that becomes this salt-encrusted playa, similar to what's happening in the Aral Sea and Lake Chad today. So that was around 1920 when the Owens Lake finally dried. Around 1970, LA wanted more water, and they realized that there was tremendous groundwater resources in Owens Valley. So they built the second LA aqueduct, and they started pumping groundwater from Owens Valley. So it's around 1970 that we start moving away from just a surface water problem and start turning it into a problem of groundwater. And so today, this is Owens Valley. I mean, it's a beautiful place. We have the LA Aqueduct is an unlined channel that slowly moves away from the Owens River and then eventually goes into two large pipes. Here you can see one of the pumping wells that's basically somewhere off to the left, and it's pumping water. These are really massive wells. There are over 300 wells in the Owens Valley. And basically in the late 80s, early 90s, we had a major drought in California. And I don't know how many of you are from California, but almost anyone who was living in California at that time had has a memory of putting bricks in the back of their toilet or something like that to try to conserve water. And at that time, they really overpumped groundwater in Owens Valley. So we can look at that period of time when they were really pumping hard and look and see how it affected ecosystems in the valley and the generation of dust across this gradient of different ecosystem types, right? Now, at one end of this gradient, we have the Owens Lake, which, as I said, is dry today. And it is the largest dust source in North America. This is a photograph here showing a little bit of surface water on the edge of the lake, a large dust storm generated from this huge salt-encrusted playa that is the Owens Lake. In 1960, when people started farming in Owens Valley, this lake was so big that they had a boat service, paddle wheel boats that would take you across the lake. So it was one of these things like a Mono Lake. It was this beautiful, huge lake that tremendous biodiversity. Today is this sort of a thing, and is causing a lot of problems. In fact, LA was sued recently, and they have to reduce the amount of dust coming from this lake. And I'll talk about that in a minute. In other parts of Owens Valley, like I said, we have this diversity of different vegetation types. Here you can see up here on the Bajada, or the alluvial fans above the lake, the basin floor, we have really deep groundwater. And so in this area, you have xeric shrub that's not dependent on groundwater at all. In actuality, this part here is a very broad, flat part of Owens Valley. This is the original lake bottom of the pluvial lakes from the last glacial maximum. This area is home to many groundwater-dependent meadows and groundwater-dependent scrub. And then as you drop down to the Owens River, you continue those groundwater-dependent plants, and then you see that outcropping of the groundwater table, which is the river. And of course, this river is now diverted about halfway up the valley and into the aqueduct. And all of the pumping in Owens Valley occurs right in the middle of these meadows. Okay, these are the places where there was obvious water. The plants were very lush. There was these huge meadows. And so LA went into those locations and put in these groundwater pumps. So one of the things we've done, so the next several slides just to show you kind of some of the steps to study this problem and the interaction between the groundwater pumping, the ecosystems, and dust. I mentioned a drought. This is a recent timeline from 1986 to 1992. Here you can see this period of low precipitation. During this time, LA increased groundwater extraction, and you can see for 3 years, the groundwater extraction was almost equal to the total water export from the valley. Okay, so they were really trying to maintain water export, but eventually they had to allow that to decline. What we did was we used satellite imagery from annual images that were taken during the summer, and we can look at changes in vegetation cover from those satellite images during this period. All of the red areas show this sort of decline in vegetation cover. You see it drops from near 100% in some areas down to 10, 20% vegetation cover. And those areas are located in the pumping districts right here and down here. Okay, so you're going to have to take it for granted. I don't have the slide that shows where all the pumping occurs. But basically what's happening is wherever you have high groundwater dependent plant species and they were pumping, you have this sort of decline in vegetation cover. Areas like here, which do have these high groundwater dependent plants that did not see pumping, the vegetation cover didn't change. So we were able to use this variable pumping intensity to look at how the groundwater depth here, going deeper as you go to the left, it influences the change in vegetation cover here from no change at all to over 100% change, right? So how do you get 100% change? There's some uncertainty in these measurements because you're making them from a satellite. So you have to understand that if vegetation was very close to 100% and then dropped down to almost 0, you could have more than 100% change. So this is so we divide this up into 3 groups: the areas that were not pumped, areas that were pumped but the groundwater remained within the rooting zone of the plants, and then the areas that were pumped so deeply that they got below the root zone of the plants. And so from this, you could estimate that the root zone is somewhere around 3 meters. Well, another thing we can do is we can take all these different locations, and we can where we know what the groundwater depth was from a test well, and we can look and see how the vegetation cover correlates with the groundwater depth or with precipitation at that time. And what we find is that this is the p-value, which is the probability of a significant relationship between groundwater or precipitation and vegetation cover. Okay, so vegetation cover, basically, if the dot is along the bottom here, vegetation cover is correlated with that model effect. And so in the blue, that's the groundwater, depth of groundwater. And in black, that's precipitation. So when groundwater is close to the surface, these dots being down here along the bottom, that means that vegetation cover is correlated with groundwater depth. But then very abruptly at about 2.5 meters, these things switch, and the precipitation becomes the significant driver of vegetation cover. So using satellite images, we're actually able to find a specific point where groundwater stops being connected with this vegetation, and the vegetation is now dependent on precipitation. Scientists love thresholds, right? So I talked about a threshold where water goes from being surface water to just below the surface and it becomes groundwater, right? That's a fundamental change in how the system is functioning, right? This is another threshold. Now it's just below the root zone of these plants. There's another fundamental change in how the system is functioning, because now those plants are not there. They're not able to be pumping that groundwater up into the atmosphere, and they're not there to hold down the soil. The final thing I'll show you about the ecosystems is that we also see really drastic changes in the composition of these plant communities, even in places where the groundwater did not go below the root zone of all the plants. It sometimes will go below the root zone of the most shallowly rooted plants, which are the grasses. So we're seeing over the last 2 decades here a decline in the proportion of grasses relative to an increase in the proportion of shrubs. Okay, so these changes are sort of halfway in between the most extreme case where you're turning a vegetated surface into a playa, an unvegetated playa. We also see these changes here. They're converting grasslands into shrublands. So here's some photographs to show you. Here's a site that has had relatively constant high groundwater. These are meadow grasses here with a few shrubs. And then here's a site that's been converted from a grassland to a shrubland. And a little below up there, I've got another picture here to show you that these sites are seeing active erosion. We can go to here and we can see this is the root structure of a desert bunch grass. This is a groundwater dependent grass that can grow to be a meter tall. But in this case, all the soil has been just blown away from around it, and it's just a root ball sitting there on the surface. That's a meter thick for scale. So my next question is, well then, okay, so if we're relying on this vegetation to maintain low dust emissions from these lake beds, right? So how does this influence this story that I just presented earlier, where you can look at a place where groundwater is going from, well, it'll start on the left, above the ground, right? So surface water, and it drops below the ground. Well, you might expect that if there's vegetation in this location, that it's going to reduce that potential for dust emission, right? Because vegetation is going to, well, first thing it's going to do is it's going to keep the groundwater low on it by itself, because it's going to be drawing that groundwater up and evaporating it through its leaves, which actually pulls the groundwater down to just to the very edge of the plant roots. It's also going to be reducing the frictional velocity of wind across the surface of the earth, right? So we could expect vegetation to have these strong effects on the ability of these places to generate dust. So we've started exploring this one too. We've gone across this gradient of different vegetation types from meadows to shrublands, and we've installed these sediment catchers. We've left them out there for 3 years, measuring them periodically over that time. And it's really simple design. Basically, this thing can spin on a central pole, and in these boxes here, it catches the wind. If there's dust in the wind, the dust gets trapped inside that box. The wind that goes in can exit through the top through a screen. So we go back after the end of a single season, and we can find several milligrams to grams of sediment in these boxes. And we generally find more sediment in the bottom and then in the top, right? That makes sense because we're seeing more mass transport along the bottom, along the surface. Paired with these things, we measure vegetation cover. And we do it in this way. We have these. We lay out transects as a tape measure. Along that tape measure, we're measuring the amount of bare soil and the amount of vegetation, but we're also measuring the vegetation height, right? Because taller vegetation should obstruct wind more easily or more effectively. Okay, so here's a couple of slides on what we're finding. The 4 slides here, the 4 plots here show those 4 different dust collectors, okay? This is your dust collector at your lowest one, 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters, 50 centimeters, and 100. What we're finding is that the relationship between the vegetation structure on the x-axis, this is the length of soil, bare soil gaps, divided by plant height. So we measure each soil gap, and then we measure the plant height, and we divide by the plant height. So it goes from 2 to 10, right? So if you have a 1 meter tall shrub and a 1 meter soil gap, then you just have a 1. That would be a 1. So most of these are larger than 1. We're talking about pretty large gaps, or else moderately sized gaps with small vegetation. And down low, there's a really strong correlation, or really high slope anyway, between the amount of dust that we collect converted to horizontal flux, meaning the grams of sediment that's moving through volume of air. And that drops as you go to the higher dust collector, right? So that makes sense. The effect of the strength of the effect of vegetation structure at each of these sites decreases as you get to the higher dust collector. But clearly, vegetation structure has a strong effect on the amount of dust that we're getting at these sites. We also have been measuring the properties of the soil. If you go out to the Owens Valley dry lake, and you'll find that the soil is really fluffy, and the salt crystals have basically broken it apart to the point that you can actually step on it and sink into your ankles. In some of our cases, we're seeing that similar thing. This is the threshold shear velocity. This is the velocity of the wind velocity in which dust starts to be moved. Okay? So we're finding at some sites where we have little tiny patches of bare soil. These are meadows, effectively meadows with little patches of bare soil. We have really soft, fluffy soil there. Okay, so those grasses are basically helping to maintain that soft, fluffy soil to continue to be there. Whereas places where we have really large amounts of bare soil, the soils have become armored. And they're now hard, more clay pan soils that do not have you need much stronger winds to move the soils. We've also been monitoring PM10, which is particle matter smaller than 10 microns, and this is a primary health hazard for humans. This is the size dust that causes asthma, and the EPA regulates this size dust. We've done it for 3 years. Those are the 3 colored bars. And we do it for winds that are blowing from the north and from the south. Okay? And we do that at 5 different locations up and down the valley. The locations are from close to the Owens Lake on the left to very far from the lake on the right. And most of the pumping occurs in the middle here. And what we're finding is that whereas the average PM10 concentration is often highest at the lake, certainly in really windy years, like the most recent year, the white bars is 2010. It was very windy conditions. We had a lot of dust produced. We're still seeing PM10 above the regulated rate of 50, or concentration of 50 micrograms per meter cubed. This is what the EPA says is the regulated limit for human health. We're seeing the exceedance of that threshold most often in the pumped meadows in the middle of the valley. So these degraded meadows, they're not necessarily producing a lot of dust, but it's enough dust to matter. It's enough to break it above the regulated thresholds. So this is a conclusion, right? Dust generation is not constrained to the extent of the dry lake in 1900. So this benefit that we've been getting from vegetation throughout the Owens Valley and is clearly being compromised by the pumping of groundwater. And so we can see, while this is still the largest site of fugitive dust in the United States, we're still seeing dust storms being formed throughout the upper parts of the valley, where until recently we were benefiting from vegetation cover to keep that dust on the ground. So this is just an example to kind of summarize. Here we have intact meadows, here are degraded meadows, and here's the Owens Lake. And this is mass transport, and this is a log scale. So the Owens Lake is still just massively dusty compared to any of the meadows. But you can see that instead of saying, whoa, well, there isn't a problem yet, right, because we're definitely seeing something of a problem here, you could just see how bad the problem could get, right? If all the vegetation were to die or be degraded, we could potentially get into this situation here, which is the Owens Lake, for a much larger region. So we're starting to get a picture of what this curve would look like. And certainly in the places where vegetation has been established for the last 10,000 years, those locations, if they're not being pumped, have the ability to maintain fluffy soils that are there and stay there and don't blow away with dust. We have to assume that in each of these endoheric basins, there are these same processes going on. Certainly in that image of Lake Chad, you saw that there's extensive wetlands that are forming as the lake is retreating. And the next stage for these places might very well be to start pumping that groundwater to capture that extra amount of water, and that may cause a large increase in the amount of dust that's produced from those locations. Which is all to say that we are benefiting from ecosystem services that are provided by these meadows. This is a view of the Owens Lake, or the Owens Valley from the north. The dry lake is 100 kilometers away. And you can see that all up here, these are all the ecosystems I'm talking about, the shrublands and the grasslands. And in this particular day, they were producing a lot of dust. Recently, I mentioned a lawsuit where LA was sued because of the dust produced by the dry lake. And they were ordered to try to mitigate for that. And guess what they're trying to do? They're trying to plant meadow grasses. These are the same grasses, they're salt-tolerant grasses that we see in the upper part of the valley. They're trying to plant these on the surface of the dry lake. This map shows the restoration effort. These are just basically the timing of the different plots that they're planting the desert grass. And you can see that it's a very large area. It covers about 40 square kilometers, which incidentally is about the size of the degraded area and further up the valley. And if you look at their records, this statement is in fact true, that they're using as much water now to try to get these grasses established on the dry lake as they're pumping from further up in the valley. So it's a story of certainly the whole cycle of the human population growth and destruction of the ecosystem, but it's really a story about ecosystem services. And you could say, you know, if you talk to LA, they'll say, you know, pat themselves on the back and say, we're benefiting from the ecosystem services of grass. We're going to plant it across the dry lake. But at the same time, they're degrading those same ecosystem services somewhere else in an attempt to try to provide them here. So before I came down here, Todd told me that I had to end with something about, you know, what you can do, right? Because there's clearly you all want to change the world. So this is what everyone says, right? I mean, we just don't drink so much water. You'll be able to save the world. Somehow this doesn't resonate, right? But it is hard to think of a way to counteract a problem that is global in nature and includes such big money, pockets full of money people as LA, right? But I will say this, that LA could do with less water. People say to me, oh, well, LA needs the water. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, when they were pumping this water, total water export from the Owens Valley dropped from 600,000 meter cubed per year to just 200,000, okay? So at that time, for some reason, the people of LA were able to do with just a third of the water that they were getting before. And they didn't get water from somewhere else. The whole region was in a drought. It's not as if they just turned on the spigot to the Colorado River or something like that at that time. So it is possible for people to use less water. The amount of water that people use across globally varies by much more than even this, right, in terms of the magnitude amount of water. And in fact, one place that I feel a lot of kinship to is in Africa and Ethiopia. People use very, very little water. And if you wanted to get involved, an excellent way would be to help develop springs instead of pumping wells. In Ethiopia, here's a well that was, a spring that was recently developed to keep farm animals out and provide a clean source of water for people. Most of all, I hope I've told you a story about the connectedness of the world, where we have connections between things like groundwater and dust that you wouldn't necessarily have seen initially until you really get into it and start thinking about it. That these connections really happen everywhere. And in fact, that is environmental science, is recognizing that everything's connected. And that to educate yourself on these things empowers you to make a bigger difference in the world. And that's also my plea to help keep water within watersheds. Thanks.